joining us are Council Member Carlina Rivera. Carlina represents Council District 2, which encompasses the East Village, but also has a piece of what you could consider the east side of Midtown in the 20s and 30s, and a chunk of the Lower East Side below Houston Street. She is one of our best friends in government in New York because, and I say this about elected or top executive officials who ride bikes, for us, they're gold because they know what it's like to be exposed to car traffic and to face crappy street designs or bad conditions, or just to feel sort of marginalized and pushed out of the way by the way we organize our streets. And so people who get that come and help. And so, like in 2019, Carlina successfully moved legislation through to make construction sites preserve bike right-of-way where they were abutting onto bike lanes. And she was, and we'll get to this, but she was pivotal in bringing open streets to the city this year during the pandemic. On the council, she chairs the hospitals committee, and I can't imagine what kind of a hot seat and just massive amount of work that has been this year. So we really, really appreciate you not only fighting for us in terms of streets during all of this, but also for being here tonight. Mike Lydon literally wrote the book on changing streets quickly in cities. And I would love to just even steal your subtitle for your book called Tactical Urbanism, Short-Term Action, Long-Term Change, which is really what I want to, get us to talk about tonight. How do we connect those two? Because we've done a lot of short-term change, which is great. So in getting started, Carlina, you were sort of in the room, in the virtual room, I guess, when we had a real vacuum around this issue of space in the city for additional space for social distancing, and at some point the council just said we have to do something here in the spring. And so I'm wondering if you can just sort of put us in that virtual room and explain what you were looking at, what you were thinking, and what you and Speaker Johnson and others ended up doing to sort of get us to open streets, because it was the council above all that made it happen. Are you muted? Sharon, can you unmute the council member? Let's see if I can do it.
You did great.
Oh, there we go. It wasn't me.
That's okay. I get it.
Sorry about that, council member.
No, that's okay. And in fact, I have muted myself because, we have a lot of household noises. We have a lot of New York City noise, and we're always trying to make sure that you could hear the speaker loud and clear. So yeah, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you for having me here. This is a great opportunity to talk about what I think is a really great program that can and has kind of morphed and evolved into a number of things, and that it continued to prove to be a benefit for our public health. That's really what I think that Open Streets is. Above everything else, it's for the health and safety of all New Yorkers. And so, in the midst of this pandemic, which has been incredibly challenging, and to all of the essential workers out there who had to go to work every single day for hours on end, we are incredibly grateful. And while we were home trying to do the right thing, obviously we were hearing from folks in our district who were stuck indoors all over the city, really, who were stuck indoors most of the day, is that they needed places to go outside safely. And at the time, we really didn't know that much on how COVID spread or the rates of transmission in the city, and how really what we had to do, except for to stay home and to be safe, right? we were still, the information was constant in terms of transmission, of how you got it, of who was vulnerable. And so while we were all processing that information, we knew one thing, is that there was a problem, and that was that our parks and our open spaces were just simply getting too crowded to be fully useful. And that's because people wanted to go outside and just take a walk for a number of reasons, primarily for our health and sanity. And so arguably, more importantly, areas of the city that had little to no parks or open space were struggling even more. And we saw that in many of the outer boroughs, where there are large families, densely populated areas, and they're all in these kinds of small apartments, and they wanted to get out and with their kids and walk outside. And so that's what we started to look around. We started to look around at solutions. I saw what folks were doing in Oakland, California, in places in Europe. They were closing neighborhood streets, so used for residents, for families, for cyclists. And so, we brought this idea, and many people, we've kind of been talking about, right? Closing streets, pedestrianizing them, making them friendlier to pedestrians and cyclists. And so we thought this was a no-brainer. It had to get done right away. And unfortunately, the mayoral administration was actually really not kind of into the idea. And in fact, they would go on record to say that they were opposed, that this is just not something that they were entertaining right now. And many people even challenged the importance of the program. And I think now, as you described in your intro, we see that it became so many things that were good for our health and the economy. So I introduced legislation in April requiring the Department of Transportation to create a formal open streets program for the remainder of the pandemic. And while DOT was not taking us very seriously when we first started talking about it, all they considered was a pretty disastrous trial run at about 4 to 5 locations, one which I visited, which was in my district and on Park Avenue South. But eventually, with a lot of help from you all, the advocates, from people testifying, they changed their tune when Speaker Johnson and I showed how serious we were in holding hearings and passing this legislation. So DOT began implementing the program that we have today, which has really become a really special program in many places. And my bill still exists. So, the mayor took it on, they warmed up to the idea, and they pretty much implemented it on the executive level. And so my bill's still kicking around. We're working now to amend it to extend the open streets program and hopefully provide a pathway towards permanent implementation.
Well, that's fascinating. I wanted to ask you about that, but since you've raised that, which I think is the sort of the big issue and the big question mark, I think in the news cycle this week alone, right, we had pretty interesting positive news about vaccine development for the pandemic. And maybe almost on cue, the New York Post had a story about people complaining about parking on the Upper West Side. And so that, that to me has always been the big question is, so we have open streets and, it's great in some places, it's struggling in other places. And we have, just tremendous uptake by the restaurant industry. And we've seen people, New Yorkers with bikes make the whole city like a big desire line throughout this year when traffic was a little bit lower. I'm concerned with what's happening now, but so what happens with all this? Because the pandemic will end at some point, and there will be pressure on the city to take back those parking spaces, and there may even be waning interest by some restaurants who just want to get back to normal in their space that they pay so much for. And I don't really know what that will look like. But since you mentioned amending the bill, is that do you see that as something that gets negotiated, or are you in conversations with City Hall? The other side of City Hall today?
I think you're right. I think we all want to go back to normal, right? We all want some sense of normalcy, but I think what we're trying to do is look at how this program really benefit New Yorkers and how we can translate that benefit into something permanent, fully realizing like not every neighborhood is the same. And maybe some people aren't quite into open streets. And I think it really does take a community-led effort. And that's why I've been so pleased to see some of these groups take on some of the open streets to manage them. But not every neighborhood has a community-based organization or a bid or really active cyclists to take that on. So I think going forward, there are two things that are driving my thinking around what a post-COVID open streets program looks like. I think what are the measures of success for an open street or whatever other temporary street change? And then how do we define through policy the best ways to pick new locations for temporary open streets? I think some of our best open streets, as I mentioned, are that successful because of active community participation. You can look at 34th Avenue in Queens. You could look at Avenue B in my district. Not every street has that, right? Not every street has this kind of magical way of thinking and these groups that wake up at 9 a.m. to move barricades and put them in place. So, let alone doing programming or any kind of like additional advocacy around things like better barriers or street furniture, which I also think are going to be important to how we successfully implement something and make it look like it's really a part of the community as seamlessly as possible. So how can we accurately assess the performance, but also the potential in an open street? So that's what me and my team are looking at now. And we're always open to ideas. And of course, that's also one of the reasons why I joined tonight, because I'm always willing to hear what other people are doing in other places. And so when it comes to adding more temporary streets to the mix, I think we really have to get back to the core of the issue, which is equity. Equity in access to open spaces, to safe streets. So maybe it's something like a metric around the number of parks in the area or the amount of recent capital investments from some of the key city agencies. And we have to think really hard about that. I think what's been happening in Oakland, how and that was my inspiration for the bill when I saw that the mayor's office wasn't moving quickly enough, is how they're conducting their open streets program, but they're really investing in the safe street needs of communities of color. And that's something I think that we should all be particularly focused on, because that's pretty much where, neighborhoods of low-income immigrant communities of color, they just do not have the same amenities, the same park space, or the same sort of investments that we're seeing in wealthier places.
So, and we've seen analyses from a few groups like Trust for Public Land and Transportation Alternatives, which did sort of point out that there was still a real missing component to the program in terms of where it was distributed and to who. But I'm curious because there is a tension there between, say, like 34th Avenue, where there's an extremely animated and active and obviously very capable group who's running that street, and the need, I think, for other neighborhoods probably to have some more city government involvement to help it happen. And we've seen that with other open space and public space programs in the city, like the public plazas. We have good examples like Diversity Plaza or in Jackson Heights or Corona Plaza. But they're kind of exceptions in places where there isn't like a rich bid to run it or even sort of a, necessarily, even a merchants association if it's not a bid or a CDC or whatever. But it's just always been striking to me that the city has kind of maintained its argument that we can do public spaces from bike corrals to plazas or whatever, but there needs to be a maintenance agreement with that. In the context of the sort of dramatic expansion of city government in the de Blasio years, why can't we get some city government help if we're going to have all these people working for the city and a vastly expanded budget, this year aside? It just seems like there needs to be some scope for that, and not just cops dropping off, barriers that have seen way too many protests or whatever. But I could go on about that. But Mike, your firm Street Plans works in cities large and small across the country and maybe to some degree the world on exactly these. I mean, what about this issue of management and somehow melding community activism and just some real help and management, some work from the city itself?
Yeah, it's a great question, John. I mean, I think I think to Carlina's point, there's no real perfect solution, citywide. Right? It's gonna be a little bit different everywhere you're working. You bring up the point that 34th Ave They have this incredibly well-organized, structured group of volunteers. But, you know, at the end of the day, does Jim Burke and all the people working with him want to be spending hours of their day every week doing this in perpetuity?
Right.
And I would say,
can they even do it at all once they're not working at home anymore?
yeah, exactly. So there's a sustainability piece to this where relying on advocates and activists to manage, even when they are well organized and rowing in the same direction for change, there's still a lot of resource constraints and challenges to them. So even where we've had success, I think there's kind of a limited long-term scope here. I think, you know, with other cities, like a Seattle or, you know, like a Portland, there's many cities that have this like kind of street type baked into residential environments that they call neighborhood greenways. And it's really a design for traffic light communities or streets or corridors that are parallel to major commercial avenues. And we've never really pursued that in New York. And so I think what, to the council member's point about Oakland, they had literally just written a plan that included lots of corridors where they're going to be making these changes anyway. So they were able to kind of build off of that immediate plan and look to it.
Throw something right up on the screen, just since you mentioned the neighborhood greenways.
Yeah, it's a street type that I think would work really well in New York, and it's something they were trying to get done in Oakland. Yeah, we can see it.
This is an older facility in Portland where you can turn onto the street, but you can't continue straight ahead on the street. And so it creates a traffic light street and people on bikes gravitate to it.
Yeah, or walking or running or jogging, skating, scooting. It's really something to look at. And the models are there where the city can do some actually relatively light infrastructural investment that can sustain itself and not require heavy amounts of ongoing maintenance. And I think what is interesting about the more lighter weight approach we've taken in New York with just these simple barricades, whether you like the aesthetics or not, is that they're relatively flexible and volunteers can go out and move them. So in Oakland, as an example, you know, they found out that people didn't like the aesthetic of what they were originally installing the open streets with. It was cones, it was traffic signs, it looked ugly, it didn't represent, you know, what folks thought about their communities. And, you know, lo and behold, there's a lot of pushback because of that. And if you start thinking about the way they've pivoted, it's actually kind of inspiring for New York to think about this, is bringing in, you know, street art and murals and planters and things that could be on wheels and move around that better represent the communities that these improvements go into. And once you have something that feels like it represents you or is part of your community itself, then people tend to gravitate around that or accept it in a way that's different than a bunch of cones or, you know, metal barricades being dropped in. It makes people have the opposite reaction. So again, so thinking, like, to zoom back out, like, how do we find models where the city can support communities and respond to their needs, and work relatively quickly but iteratively to make these changes as we go. So New York's in this moment right now where we can iterate on what we've done and make some of these changes a little bit more permanent where there's clear desire for them.
One of the things that is interesting to me is that I haven't heard anything, including out of DOT, about the existing program they had for sort of temporary pedestrianism called Weekend Walks, which I helped to set up back in 2008, which was, you know, kind of intended as the neighborhood counterpart to Summer Streets. And at the time, we bought a couple big sets of sort of street furniture that would get moved around from place to place, because people did these in different seasons. Like they would do like the Saturdays in August in Bay Ridge, or the Sundays in June in Williamsburg. And I haven't looked at it in a while, and it's been suspended, you know, and sort of the web page for it now says, go check out the open streets, because we're not doing the programming that we used to do with these. And that was one of the requirements for applying communities, was to have a lot of programming, so that the space wasn't just like, you know, an empty street that motorists would get mad about, but that there was something going on there during those times. But it seems like a neighborhood greenway, you could sort of do both, right? You could have a traffic light street, and then you could have occasional community programming for whatever you wanted to do. And you could obviously do it in different ways on different street types, in terms of a commercial high street versus, you know, a residential block. But those kind of street types, we don't really talk about or differentiate in New York in the way we do things. And it's very striking if you go around the world, not just Europe, but South American centers of cities, Tokyo, the pedestrian street isn't really a thing. And we have plazas, but we don't really just have pedestrian streets, even though we do have places where they would make a lot of sense and work very well, and places where, frankly, it's insane and unbelievably inefficient to drive, like anywhere on the small streets south of Chambers Street and some of the adjoining neighborhoods as well. So, I wonder if we can sort of get to that. And, and one of my other thoughts is there a way to sort of think about this process in terms of what the street master plan, which is still the city's law. We don't know exactly, the administration said they want to push back the work on it, which to me is not the end of the world, because I would really rather have the next mayor own it than have it sort of be handed off from this administration to the next. But that aside, it seems like there are goals for pedestrian space, targeted in that legislation. And this is one really important way we can meet that target, is thinking about open streets, thinking about pedestrian streets, and thinking about a variety of street types. Even the city's Green Wave Plan, which was put out last year in response to bike fatalities, talked about getting to bike boulevards, which is another word for neighborhood greenways, where you do create the traffic light thing in it. And it's fascinating to me that open streets and those things are so much easier to set up, and you don't have the parking battle that bike lanes always tend to create. Yet we haven't tried them in New York, and instead we wage trench warfare over every parking space. So I just hope we can sort of blow the conversation out a little bit. But I'm concerned with what 2021 looks like as a transition year from pandemic, last year of de Blasio, and into the next administration, and sort of how we sort of hurl ourselves forward with positive momentum.
I think a couple things. I think Weekend Walks is a great program. It isn't that well known, but I think it's worked well. I think the Streets Master Plan, right? That's the law. It'll need to be kind of probably remixed, reimagined, maybe under the next administration. I think these are a framework for open streets as a permanent policy. I think it's the beginning of that, all of these things. I think to Mike's point, I wish we had a more comprehensive vision, like something a little bit more, holistic, and we're getting there piecemeal. And unfortunately, even tonight, my community is listening to a plan to bring protected bike lanes to Avenue C. And, 61 pedestrians, 34 bicyclists have been injured on Houston Street and Avenue C alone, with people killed. And so I'm trying to figure out, how we can really address what is a very, very serious, tragic problem. I think we really need to see an entire policy framework established for temporarily, maybe testing, piloting flexible street treatments for pedestrians, for stores, for cyclists, for all of it. One thing that I think we need to see implemented with open streets in any future policy, and something that the city already is kind of doing for Weekend Walks, is to bring that temporary street furniture to help activate streets that aren't currently designed for active pedestrian use, even when they are closed. And I know, for example, you can look at Vanderbilt Avenue in Brooklyn, which has been very, very, I think it's been very successful because of its median, which is right in the middle of the street. And that features trees and a natural kind of resting place and shade. I think we have to find temporary methods of accomplishing that same thing. And I'm definitely looking at other cities in the world, whether it's in Colombia or, it's in Paris. I do think some of these examples exist out there, but we're continuing to go back to that same sort of planning method, which I think is very outdated and antiquated. This is what we're, planning a city for cars. And I realize that cars are our reality, but, it has to be about investing in public transportation and public space. And something like the bill that we passed to do the redesign checklist, I thought was great. But every time we repave a street, I think that's a missed opportunity to redesign it in a way that's better accommodating for people with disabilities, for our seniors who are walking down the street, whatever it is. So I do think these programs are kind of like great ingredients for something really delicious for everyone. I think it's going to take a while to get there, and it's going to take a few trials. But I think that's why we have experts like you all and the advocates and the people that are out there actively cycling. And there's so much talent here in New York City and across the country. I just think we need someone that has that bold vision and that political will to make it so.
I think the talent thing is really interesting because we do have incredible, human resources in New York City, more so than any other place I've been to. And we have a jobs crisis right now. We have youth that need to be engaged. And I feel like there's some sort of overlap here that we're missing around the maintenance and management of things that are technically not that difficult if you're old enough to move a barricade or a planter into the street and monitor something after school for 4 hours, right? I think there's ways to make connections around the management of these spaces temporarily. And it can be, time of day and day of week. It doesn't have to be all the time everywhere. I think, and we can get to streets that are longer term over time, get built out and designed around these uses. And we see that happening in New York from the stuff that you worked on, John, 10 years ago, how that's now becoming more permanent. So we have a pipeline that we can leverage. Hopefully that pipeline can be stronger. But I think we're kind of missing that piece of getting over the hump of, well, we don't have a bid, or we don't have 100 volunteers who are coming out. And we got to find a few more creative solutions to overcome that.
I mean, it's always been striking because, one of the constraints on summer streets was the amount of police that was, that the department always wanted to deploy, and it circumscribed the hours that you could close the streets. And one of the big breakthroughs with open streets this year was that we have public spaces without police presence, or regular, sort of people assigned to it all the time.
Right.
Since you mentioned, Bogota, they use the equivalent of like the Boy Scouts to run this massive, summer streets type thing, mostly throughout the year, as far as I know, and many, many more miles than we do for say summer streets. So yeah, I think there should be that sort of civic core, and maybe there is like a Green New Deal kind of thing where we can think about this as COVID recovery. I mean, I would like to see that around construction too, like greenways, but and actual building plazas out with hard materials. But that's really interesting. I mean, Mike, your book is short-term action, long-term change. I mean, who have you seen sort of negotiate this kind of thing successfully? I mean, because in my view, we've kind of reached the limits of the Jeanette, paint everything quickly in New York, because just our bike lanes and everything else are overrun with parked and driving cars, and I want to see some steel posts in the street. But you're an expert on painting and changing things quickly. But I'm sure some of your clients have tried to make that transition or trying to figure it out.
Yeah, I mean, really, that next step is to figure out the relationship between different departments and agencies. So, as you know, John and council member, that there's real need of different agencies, departments that don't necessarily always collaborate well. And that can be the case in a city of 10,000 as it can in a million or 10 million. So finding mechanisms and ways to get people into the room to understand the broader policy goals and the roles that they play in achieving that, and having the actual political will to say to sanitation, like, no, you're going to have to accept a new vehicle or a new standard that we're all going to figure out together, is where I see, particularly in smaller cities, a bit more alignment and stronger leadership when they've got the political will to do it. It just seems to be a little bit easier to get things like that done when your agencies aren't themselves, could be a state government in some other place in the United States. So there's some real inherent challenges and issues in that. But while you develop and create not just agency or department alignment, you've got to think about just project delivery overall and what the pipeline is for that and what the mechanisms and processes are to evaluate and understand when do you go from the paint and the planters into something that's metal or steel or curb and concrete. How does that happen? And designing that system very intentionally is one that a lot of places haven't figured out yet. And I think that's really some of the next steps. But as much as that is the next step, so too is actually empowering people to make changes on their block that can be temporary or interim, that are lighter weight, that start to introduce these ideas, and not making that difficult and not making that challenging, so that there's kind of this system, this ecosystem of advocates and activists have an outlet, right? They can go paint their police barricades, like the beautiful colors that you see on Avenue B, right? You can have that outlet, but then how does that create the political will and the awareness and the understanding that that can be more? And that's where the city and the actors have to meet each other.
Let me ask another question, which is a little bit different, and I thought about it, Carlina, when I mentioned the hospitals committee. We just saw, like a week or two ago, a big coalition of doctors and medical people in London weighed in favor of the mayor's streetscape plan, where we are seeing strong leadership from the mayor of London to really accelerate the bike and pedestrian and transit use of streets, using the pandemic kind of as a catapult to accelerate what they had already planned, and where they were seeing some degree of trench warfare because of the structure of their city government. But they had a bunch of health officials weigh in and say, look, our air is bad. We're too sedentary. These things meet a bunch of other types of goals that we have as a society, as a country, and can really help. And I want to then segue into bikes a little bit from this, but is that connection being made here in New York? Not necessarily from the medical industry, but as a city, understanding that this would be good for those issues, and of course there would be an equity component for who is afflicted by whatever heart disease, respiratory issues, not just during the pandemic, but at other times.
Sure. I mean, absolutely. I think we get more cars off the road, we reduce traffic. Clearly, I think air quality improves. I also think the focus on someone just not in a car, whether you're a pedestrian, you're a cyclist, or you're someone who doesn't own a car, which is a lot of people in New York City, and you rely on public transit, that's where our investments should be. I have, in New York City, I have the first busway. There was tremendous opposition to having buses run on their own lane, to be more efficient and to actually get them through the communities faster, reducing traffic, reducing congestion. That's, even noise can be bad for your health. So I think that proved to a lot of people it's very successful, and I hope to implement other busways along with my colleagues' support in other parts of the city. I think it's very clear that having green infrastructure is the right way to go. And I think when you mentioned the Green New Deal, this will certainly be a part of that. We should be focused on people-powered transportation and public transportation. And we have to move all of that to the greenest fleet possible. I think that's pretty much a no-brainer. It's just, it's a real long-term vision. Most people can't see spending all of this money on changing infrastructure, on converting the fleet to something green when it comes to our buses, our trains, and everything else. But the science is there, the health experts are there, and I hope that's to me, that is the first thing I go to when I spoke about open streets. Yes, did I know it was going to lead to a good a lifeline for the restaurants, and that it would lead to open schools and open stores and open culture to get our economy back on that road to recovery? Absolutely. That was always a part of the vision. But first and foremost, it was to get people to walk around their communities and to realize that we didn't have to always hop in a car to get where we needed to go. We just have to make it friendlier to do so.
I mean, since you mentioned the busway, I was kind of, I had this moment this summer where I thought maybe the city was turning a corner, because it sounded to me like initially they were going to put the busway on Fifth Avenue and in J Street and in a few other locations and study it in place and not do the trench warfare at the local level about whether or not to do it. And look, they got it in on J Street so far, and they're going to do it in Flushing apparently, but they went, they got some blowback on Fifth and went and sort of scuttled the project very quickly. So, and Mike, I think you just alluded to this at the local level. Can't we just give people tools and let them try some things, and they don't have to be permanent? I mean, when we pedestrianized Broadway in Times Square, we just announced it and said, look, we're doing it for 6 months. We're going to study it in place. You can have your input by walking around in it and checking it out, and drive to it if you want and see how that goes. But we did that, and there was a very, there was an objective set of things that were studied, and the mayor concluded that we had met them, and the bids loved it, and the hotels didn't fight it, and it's worked. So I think you need to have a component of action in these things, or you're never gonna realize
Right.
that musicians could come out and that the restaurant industry could maybe not be saved, but at least could be preserved to some degree, if you don't actually just do it. And I think that's one of the other interesting things about Open Streets, is that we just did it. We tried it in place, and people have asked for adjustments, and some of them have just been like run over by drivers, but in other places it's been a huge positive change. And I think some people will see a hard time going back.
I think
we've experienced it in place, and we've allowed people to do that.
Yeah, underscoring that the pilot is the process, I think, is really important for people. Most people don't sit around on Zoom until 7:15 at night talking about busways. Let's just be honest. As much as I love doing it with you all, these things are a little bit esoteric or abstract, or not core to daily survival for most people in New York City. But when you give them an experience of something that's positive, that they can actually look at and complain about something that's real and not imagined, there's a reality there that creates important feedback loops for city leadership, right? And to find where there is the political will to keep going further, or where things need to adjust or tweak, or where, quite frankly, things get removed and go back to the way that they were. And it's a way that the city at scale can kind of ferret out where those opportunities are. And I think the more that you saw Open Streets get successful, particularly for restaurants, the more people started saying, we want that here too. We need that in our district, in our neighborhood to survive. Or I want to go out with my family and eat for once after 4 months of not doing that, right? It's a really important thing to do. So giving people that experience is critical. I think if I could say one thing about the busways, is that while we know it's temporary, we know the kinds of equipment and machinery that might have to be used to reverse it back, it looks permanent to a lot of people. When you roll out the MMA or the epoxy gravel or whatever it might be, we know that's still relatively lightweight and inexpensive in the grand scheme of things. So that we might still be missing that piece, that weekend walk piece approach, which is the introductory 1 weekend, 1 week, 1 month, and not skipping right ahead to the 1 year, because that sort of materiality starts to look more scary to some people who are opposed to change. And again, I think the more we break down these barriers and do more in New York City, that's seen as a success, more people start asking for it. And we've seen that with City Bike, we've seen that with bike lanes, we've seen that starting with busways. Like it's going to take on that momentum. It just takes a while to get the engine up and running.
Might be
bad metaphor.
Yeah. So, I mean, Mike, is there any place that you know of that actually just uses that as its planning approach? Just, to supplant the whole design and defend kind of, thing that works so poorly?
Yeah, I mean, there's the community of Burlington, Vermont, where we've done a lot of work. I've spoken a lot about that in the past several years, but they have the 7-day demonstration project that activists can lead, and the city partners with them. And they've got the interim design toolkit, which is they don't roll out new street designs unless they first do this interim pilot approach to really study it and figure out, how do we deal with the snow when we get 3 feet of it at a time, when we've never had protected bike lanes, right? You got to try these things and then problem solve. So they kind of build those steps in between the demonstrations, the pilots, the interim, and then they get to, okay, where do we put our limited resources, invest in things that are working really well and that we've iterated upon. So that's a small city example.
Of course, Mayor Bernie Sanders said pedestrianized Church Street, so there's always
right. There's a legacy there. In fact, that started with a very temporary weekend demonstration project, by the way. But bigger cities are doing this, or just doing it in kind of a siloed or just one-off kind of way, rather than trying to get to a scalable, replicable, real policy-based approach. And I think that, again, that is kind of the next level where some of this stuff has to go.
So since we are Bike New York, I want to talk more about bikes, and it gets back to this neighborhood greenways or bike boulevards sort of idea. The Oakland plan. It's interesting that and we were all very inspired by it, but the Oakland plan was sort of rushed onto national television, and the mayor was, really like going crazy at it at a time when they actually basically had a map that looked really good, but they didn't do all that much, like in the first month. I'm friends with the Oakland DOT commissioner, who was a New Yorker, by the way, and New York City DOT veteran. Told me that stuff, but one of the things that was very striking about the map is that the lines connected, and they were pretty long. And with our open streets, we talked about 34th Avenue in Queens. We only have a couple of these things that are like a mile long. 34th Avenue being one, Berry Street in Williamsburg being another. And those are also both on existing painted bike lanes, so people are already habituated to using those as bike routes. And they work really well. And I ride through Berry Street regularly. It's on one of my, very traveled paths, and it's great. It's fantastic. I mean, it was always okay, but it's much better now. And so I'm just, I'm still sort of stumped at why we aren't trying more longer open streets. Like, the city had this terrible pop-up bike lane program in the summer where they would put out traffic barrels and, everybody would throw them out of the way or just drive around them. And it just struck me, if you had done sort of an open street on, say, West 38th and 39th, where had a really abysmal pop-up situation, it might have just worked great. And, look, traffic was pretty light, obviously, in the spring and early summer, but it's coming back in a big way now. And it feels like here in Greenpoint, it's been back since June. And if we just had more of these things, like, you wouldn't have to fight for the parking, you wouldn't have to design anything except some barricades, and you could sort of have a much broader thing. And the thing we're really losing out on, I think, and that we've kind of missed, is preserving that low traffic environment in more places that got so many people out on bikes in the spring and the summer. That's starting to go away now as we reopen and as people just start to do more things. And frankly, as people start doing local trips in cars, certainly around here, that's happening. So I don't know, I just, and the city had recognized this as a format that might work for them before the pandemic, but we're not seeing it so far. And I hope we can get to that kind of network of open streets that I think, residents will also embrace, because it means less craziness on their street. I mean, it does mean you have to put the traffic somewhere, but there's also an evaporative, impact that we see in most places when you do start to reduce capacity.
Well, I mean, I think, there's a long-term fight over parking. I think we need a parking revolution. And it's been, and I always think about bikes. I think about scooters, about the little razors, the Revels and the motorcycles. I feel like more people are on motorcycles too. That's just, I don't want to say it's anecdotal. I feel like I actively hear people putting together motorcycle clubs. But anyway, I'll work on legislation around that. And I certainly want to hear what the Department of Transportation is planning in terms of bike boulevards, also like how advocates think that this idea could be implemented. I think a lot of people have different ideas for what a bike boulevard can be, and that's okay. But I think that gets to the larger issue with open streets. I think I mentioned all the kind of reiterations or what open streets became. And I think the program grew so quickly with the restaurants, with the schools, with the stores, that we kind of lost sight what this was specifically about. And that doesn't mean that all those programs aren't good ones. They are, and I'm proud that it's happened. And again, we're going to need them to get people back kind of into the swing of things once we're safe. But we have to start considering from this experience is how can we implement bike lanes and other protective measures on a temporary basis, right? See how they perform. This is, I guess, the pilot argument, and then put down real capital dollars for full implementation at a later point. I think this allows us to just install bike lanes more quickly and cheaper, of course, which, as you probably know, that's another big challenge that DOT faces, which is getting their projects done. They have very specific, very expensive ways of implementing bike lanes. And right now we let our community boards provide feedback. I mentioned my community board is going through a presentation right now before a project gets implemented, but once it's in the ground, DOT generally kind of, throws up their hands and they walk away. I think, why can't we instead do what we did with the 14th Street busway, again, which is the pilot example, implement a project with temporary measures, see how it goes, and then we finish the full project later. And that's what I see as kind of the lasting accomplishment of the Open Streets experiment. It shows that our streets are much more easily flexible, they're adaptable. And I think that's something that we don't typically give them credit for. I think we just pretty much said, oh, this is where you drive and park the car. Mm-hmm. I hope that inspires some real change around kind of our own bike policies. And we can try that. We can try something temporary and do something more lasting later on. I'm totally okay with that. Always open for feedback. I remember with the busway, I did walkthroughs, I did meetings, I talked to all types of constituents, because I realized that, to change someone's way of thinking, kind of what we've been preconditioned to think what our streets are for, that's going to take a while. Yeah. Not everyone rides bike, not everyone can. So let's figure out how to make this street really for the public. And I think that's something that maybe we've kind of lost sight of.
Yeah, I mean, I think we really need something like what you're describing, because, the bike lanes that are set off by parked cars, like First and Second Avenue in your neighborhood, those work pretty well. But the DOT has not figured out a good protected bike lane template for a place where you don't have room for that. We have the plastic sticks and they're just abysmal, and they just get run over and they are completely ignored. And I think they like, nobody likes them. The cyclists hate them. The drivers want to run them over, and it just reduces the whole credibility of the idea. So I think that's why I like the neighborhood greenways thing, is because we could just do it and in narrow streets. Like, there's huge grids in Queens where you don't have real wide streets anywhere, and you're just not going to get a bike lane, even a painted one, in a lot of those places. So let's limit the car traffic and slow everybody down, and just cyclists will go there. They will. We know that from this summer. The argument about what New Yorkers will do given a little less traffic has been concluded, in my view. We will ride bikes all over the place.
And we'll hang out and we'll meet people and we'll connect and we'll see little kids on bikes and scooters. And it's just a amazing thing in my neighborhood in Clinton Hill. Willoughby has been that street for us since, the late spring. It's to be horrible to see it go back to not being what it has been for our community, and connecting to Fort Greene Park. Like, that's our way to get to the park. And so my way to get home from Dumbo, where my office is. It's just a really pleasant street. And that white stripe that says this is where you bike, it means nothing now. It's just, this is everyone's street. And yet people still park there, who have to, and, emergency vehicles get through and deliveries get made. And there's like a lovely flexibility to that we have to also think about not over designing. And I think, we're talking a lot about the tactics, but the strategy has, like, things have to connect and work together. And that's the biggest critique I have of being a practitioner, living and observing and advocating in New York, is that many other cities have a real strategy around this link and then that link and this link and that link, and it builds on itself and the network becomes usable over time, as opposed to, well, way out here, somebody got, killed. So we're going to have a hearing and go through the CB process and invest here. And then someone over here has a strong community group saying we need this and that. And all of a sudden you've got, you're spreading yourself really thin and not creating the full network effect. And New York's huge, so we could do this borough by borough or neighborhood by neighborhood, just making sure we're connecting places and desire lines that people want to go. And I think that's the strategy piece to this, where open streets can be reconsidered, and the neighborhood greenways, or wherever this becomes, can think of it at that kind of network level, which is missing.
I mean, that's really interesting. I think, at the popular level, the street dining has probably been, the thing that most people get to do and use the open streets for, or, and certainly gets reflected back in the press a lot. But what's interesting, and Mike, you just made me think about it, is, the sidewalk cafe process prior to the pandemic was just almost punitive in the way it like the standards it set, the cost of getting the license from Consumer Affairs, and DOT had a separate program called Street Seats, which I think had kind of fallen by the wayside, or was being very, very minimally tended to. So it just seems like that's got to change, right? I mean, we've just shown the appetite for being in the street and socializing in that way, and how the city, now that we're subtropical New York, like, it's like a 10-month thing, right?
Well, I think the biggest lesson, this is what I've been telling other people who are marveling at our 10,000 restaurants in the streets, is the most important thing, the most incredible lesson we could look to internally in New York City is that self-certification process, right? Like, here's the basic parameters. We know you need to do it. Figure out the best way for you to do it with your business and your restaurant, and we'll create a very light framework, and then we might come check on you later. Like, that is so not New York in a lot of ways around governance and bureaucracy. And it led to this flowering of unbelievably creative installations that reflect the businesses and the communities and the cultures that call New York home. And so I would love to find more ways where we can empower and enable communities and businesses to do these things and make it a self-certification process, or just easier to do what seems to be the right thing in so many of our neighborhoods.
But how do you think, so, I mean, given the heavy duty bureaucracy and sort of approach to, and we just have a large city government, and generally I like that because we have capacity that other places just don't have at all to do things. And how do we make those circuits connect better? I mean, you mentioned that we have, city departments that are bigger than state governments in a lot of places. And my own experience, I know this world because you could spend months not talking to anybody outside your agency if you're in one of those jobs, and that's not healthy. What does it take to sort of get the leadership to break down those things and to frame the issue so that it is about function, and it is, it connects everything from economic growth and opportunities and jobs, coming out of this recession, to public health and street safety and climate friendly transportation. Some of us have started talking a little bit about a deputy mayor for infrastructure. And, when you look at even going back through the administrations I've experienced here in the city, there's never been one focal point in City Hall, for instance, that is in charge of the physical city. DOT is often under operations. De Blasio is like blown it all out of the water, and you can't figure out how it's organized at all, especially in his first term. But there's never been like an infrastructure deputy mayor, or even just like something else that, city planning is often different from DOT. And, look, DOT is a very operational agency, and there is a huge operations piece to this stuff too. But those things have to work too. And you mentioned, sanitation vehicles as a limiter on street design, and all those things are there. But someone who's in charge of the physical city, we never had Bloomberg was interested in it if you brought stuff to him, but you've never had a mayor who was just like instinctively interested in it, like the way, say, Corey Johnson is. So I don't know how you do that and how you sort of circuit these things together, but it's good. At least a more multipolar city government has been good for us now because we've needed the leadership out of the council. But I'm just sort of musing about this. But it's very hard to get, say, a streetscape plan for London without a mayor who's going to push it, and people under the mayor whose job it is to push it. Same with the mayor of Paris. I mean, she's got people around her, and this is their job, making these things work. And we just don't have that in New York. We have sort of DOT whipsawed by police, and just at the mercy of other things that they can't change. Even where they want to.
In leadership, right? I mean, that's what a lot of it comes down to, having the vision and directing this incredible, governance structure that we have. It's huge, right? So it's a hard thing to organize and move on when it's at the scale of New York City government, for sure. But when it's a priority, when there's an economic imperative, when 100,000 jobs are on the line, all of a sudden, poof, self-certify, and you can operate in the roadway. It's just, we can innovate, and we've done it. We've done it at a scale that we've not seen anywhere else in the United States, if not the globe. So we can do it. It does take that stroke of the pen, that leadership, that direction, and clearly the understanding by the populace that this is important.
Right. And ultimately, we would need to have some people and some units that were doing these things, creating the toolboxes that you mentioned, figuring out how to get them into community hands and to allow them to go forward. But so I think there's probably a lot of institutional innovation that we need around these kind of quick things that we've done, which is hard. It's hard to do, but you know, I've seen some of it up close within one department, but we need to cross department lines, and it is very, very hard.
Yeah, and I think to create that like holistic network that I mentioned for bikes, for pedestrians, for small businesses, for the cars, I think we really do need a real master plan. I think that the leadership, absolutely, but to have that real master plan so everyone has the goals, they have the metrics, they understand that this is an infrastructure plan that's supposed to be comprehensive. There will have to be interagency collaboration, and maybe that one leader, that deputy mayor of infrastructure can do it. You know, I have a bill for an Office of Active Transportation, and essentially what everyone calls the bike mayor bill, but it's really for that. It's really to have someone who is looking at creating a larger network for just so you can connect. I think for us as cyclists, we have routes. I'm okay knowing that like there are a couple of protected bike lanes, avenues, side streets that I could take to where I need to go. I feel safer and more confident as I step out onto the road. And that's ultimately what people are seeking when biking in New York City, is a little bit more confidence. And how do you do that? Is you create the infrastructure. And how do you create the infrastructure? Which is you have a plan, which is essentially green, and you are making the jobs that are connected to it. So I think to all of us, it makes a lot of sense. I do think regardless of a streets master plan or how long the pandemic lasts, that it is going to come down to the budgetary situation that our city is currently facing. I think we've seen the street master plan already delayed by the current commissioner of DOT, and she's referred to that delay as because of budget challenges. And I think just like we saw last year, this past budget around the NYPD and funding for community anti-violence programs, if advocates come together with clear goals, with the dollar amounts, with a concerted campaign that is diverse, that is, you know, from the bottom up, that we can influence these policy decisions. And I think that regardless of the fiscal crisis, that we do have to make investments, and this is a smart one. I'll certainly be looking at DOT's budget proposals. I hope advocates will be coming up with plans of their own. And then hopefully we can all come together and I think really kind of collaborate on something that will hopefully be long lasting. And if it's just a few pilot programs in the meantime to make people comfortable, then that's the way to go. Because I think it's ultimately what New York City should strive to be.
I mean, a lot of us were really, you know, looking at the street master plan as a way for the city's leadership to frame this as, here's something we're going to do. It's coming. Get involved and help tell us how to do it in your neighborhood. But we're not gonna go to your community board and give you a chance to say no. We're gonna give you a chance to get on board and help us do these goals, because they are the goals and they are the law, and we're gonna do it. It's coming. So help us figure this out. Because we have to go there, and you know, if we get a mayor who's serious about climate and you know, and wants to take street safety, you know, to the next level, we're going to have to do those things, and you know, and to make our huge mass transit system work much better than it does.
And we can add our own flair. You know, we add those murals, we add that street art, and we add things I think that are reflective of our city and the people that live here, and certainly of those communities. And I think that also creates a type of ownership that could be fun, and that will ultimately prove beneficial because of our own, of course, the financial investment, but our own emotional investment, that we're trying to do something that I truly think is for our public health.